This episode is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And We Refuse Week continues. Our very own Kelly Carter-Jackson has a new book, We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. And as listeners know, you write a book, you get a week. So here we are, the second of third episodes on the book and some of the fascinating stories within. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and author Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
You've been author for a while, but, I just gave you that new title here.
Now she's an author.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a specific story from the book that I think we're going to focus on in this episode, but just in terms of kind of writing the book, and both of you have done this, and I'm really fascinated by it as someone who talks into a microphone a lot, but you recorded the audiobook for this too, Kelly?
Yeah, I did. And I took a lot of tips from Nikki because Nikki did it first, and I didn't realize, and Nikki, you've said this too, that like you don't realize how many words you don't know how to pronounce until you go to record.
Still get letters, Kelly, so just note that in your future.
Oh man! For me, it was the first chapter is on revolution, and so we look at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution more specifically, and all of these French names. I was like, oh my God. I took French. I took French even in college. And I was like, and it's so funny because the sound, producer will play you a clip of how you pronounce the word. Mm-hmm. But I was like, my Haitian friends are going to kill me. I know I'm going to get feedback. I know. I was like, I'm sorry. I have such an American accent on this French.
Kelly, my story on that end was sort of the opposite in a way. It was, I had to read the selection from the Dartmouth Review that was written in fake Ebonics. This
gosh.
Selection.
Right.
And I saw it coming up on the page and I was like, oh boy. How am I going to do this?
Can we fly in a voice actor?
One take.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's tough. I mean, you do realize you sort of stop and start a lot, and then you get a good momentum, and then it's and time flies in the recording booth too. The sound producer will be like, okay, so we've been doing this for 2 hours. Do you want to take a break? And I'm like, yes, I do.
When you write a book, I would imagine, you are so familiar with that copy. You've written it, rewritten it, edited it, rewritten it. But as you're reading it out loud, do you kind of see it in a new way?
Oh my gosh, totally. I feel like I had, and again, this is stuff I would only cringe about, but I'm like, oh, I feel like I said that already. It might be redundant. Right. Oh, this is repetitive. There are moments where I just, or you'll find a typo. There's country instead of county or something like that. Right. That's little that will get cleaned up in the next edition or whatever. But you find those things and it's because you can't do anything to change it. But yeah, I found myself, trying to let that go. I'm really just trying to soak up the fact that I don't know, I've always wanted to be able to record my own book. I tell people a lot of times I had sort of a slight speech impediment growing up. I had struggled with R's and I was in speech for a long, long time. And so being able to not be self-conscious about my voice, I think was really affirming for me. Because, kids are cruel. When you're a little kid and people tease you for how you pronounce certain words or whatever. But this was kind of yeah, look at me now. That's how I
so
felt.
Great.
I felt in the recording booth. It was a good feeling. All
That's awesome.
Daunting.
All right. Well, obviously, listeners, you can read the book, but if you like Kelly's voice, which I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably do, you can go listen to the audiobook as well. But let's talk about another story from your piece. So last time we did a sort of personal history. Now, you want to take us to 1919? We've talked about the 1919 Washington riots before, but you have a specific story from within that. But you want to tell us about those riots?
Yes. So we covered this on the podcast, I'm not sure, maybe a year ago. In 1919, there was a sort of summer of riots. It was famously known as Red Summer, where all throughout the country, race riots are taking place in, Florida and in Texas and in Arkansas and in places, big cities like Chicago. And Washington, D.C. is no exception. In the summer of 1919, Black soldiers are returning from World War I. And when they come back to the United States, they are met with all kinds of racial violence. And so as it goes with a lot of these riots, we're not quite sure is like what becomes sort of like the strike that lets the match, but it's often always like an allegation of rape or an allegation of like, Black insolence on the part of, white people. And in this particular instance in Washington, D.C., there was an alleged rumor that a Black man had tried to sexually assault a white man, and it set the entire city off. And so for about 4 or 5 days, there is riots breaking out in the street. There's racial violence. White people are, shooting at Black people. Black people are lynched in broad daylight. They are pulled from streetcars and beaten. There are mobs that come into Black neighborhoods and throw rocks at their homes and shoot at their homes. And it is a terrifying experience. Carter G. Woodson writes about this moment where he was a dean at Howard University and he was walking home when the riots broke out. And he sees someone literally get killed in the middle of the street. A Black person gets jumped by several white men, and he was terrified to witness this murder take place. So there are all kinds of stories about, the violence that's happening. But there's one story in particular that just stuck with me, and I said, I have to write about this and put it in the book. And that's the story of a 17-year-old Black girl by the name of Carrie Johnson. So Carrie Johnson is living in Washington, D.C. When the riots break out, and she's in a Black neighborhood, but a Black neighborhood that's surrounded by a white neighborhood. And these white mobs are literally taking to Black neighborhoods and marching down the street, and they are breaking into Black homes. They are, throwing rocks. They are pulling Black people out of their homes to beat them up. And she sees all of this happening. She is in the house with her father. It's just her and her father. And her father must have taught her how to use a gun, because she says, I need to defend myself. And she goes up to the second floor of her home so that she can have an advantage of seeing out over her neighborhood and seeing who's coming from a distance. And at that moment, she sees the mob coming and she starts to take pot shots at the mob, literally picking people off. She hits one of the people that are storming down the street, and there are cops outside on her block, but of course they're not protecting the Black homes. White people are coming up to the cops saying, there's someone in this home. They're shooting at us. You need to go in this house and find out who's shooting at us. And so the cops say, all right, we'll check it out. And this is when Carrie decides, she gets her dad. They hide under the bed. They know it's not going to be good for them. They're both armed under the bed, but they know that, violence is imminent. And these cops, they don't announce themselves. They break down the door. It's about 2 of them, 2 detectives, where they walk through a quiet, dark house. They go up the stairs. They go to the second floor into one of the bedrooms, which Carrie and her father are hiding under the bed. And as soon as they open the door, shots are ringing out. Carrie starts shooting from under the bed, shooting anyone that she thinks is trying to break into her home and attack. And in the process, she shoots one of the officers, Harry Wilson, twice. She gets shot in the thigh. Her father is shot in the shoulder. When it's all said and done, Officer Wilson is dead, lying on the floor of her bedroom. There are bullet holes all in the walls. And it is a terrifying scene to see for sure. Paramedics show up. They take Carrie and her father, and word spreads that this was Carrie's doing. This 17-year-old Black girl shot and killed a white police officer. And in that moment, I'm like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen to this young Black girl? I thought she was going to be lynched on the spot. Yeah. It's 1919, this is the height of lynching in America. But that doesn't happen. She is arrested, and she's taken into custody. And I don't know if I should say what happens to her. I feel like I need to read the
Let's
book.
talk a little bit about that incident and that context, because, you know, I think you're right to say, like, gosh, what is the story of this moment and how does it play? And I mean, I went and looked at some of the newspaper accounts in the days after this incident, and Carrie Johnson is referred to in the paper as a, quote, sniping negress. And there's this notion, this rumor that she's actually, you know, acting as a sniper and looking out her window and shooting people. And so, you know, we've seen how much the sort of media frenzy in the wake of incidents like this takes off.
The media frenzy was insane. I mean, in some ways it's interesting because the white press does not really want to cover the fact that a black teenage girl was responsible for killing this police officer. They want his death to look honorable. And so it's, you know, like wife and child loses, you know, spouse in the line of duty, you know, killed by a Negro. But they won't say that it's a girl or that it's, you know, a 17-year-old girl at that, a black girl. The black press, though, shockingly, you know, they come to Carrie's aid. They really see her as a heroine, as someone who was brave and courageous, who was protecting herself, protecting her father, protecting her community. There's a poem I found written by an 11-year-old black girl named Martina Sims, who writes about Carrie's bravery and black soldiers returning from war and how they are not going to take, you know, sort of like white supremacy and they're going to fight back. I mean, there are funds that are raised all across the country. People are hearing about what Carrie Johnson did and they are sympathizing with her and making sure that she has legal counsel and funds to get proper legal counsel. I mean, that to me was the most sort of shocking thing. It's not necessarily what happens to her, but the response around her actions, that people are praising her and really hailing her as this heroine.
There's a really important idea in this story that I would love to hear you talk about more, and that is what it means to claim self-defense when you shoot a police officer and what that says about the role that the police play as part of the threat against black people in the United States. Like, how do you negotiate that dynamic?
Well, for one, you know, to address the latter, the police are not there to protect the black community. Like, protect and serve has nothing to do with the black community. And the black community is very much aware of that they cannot sort of seek out the police or the law or law enforcement as a protector for their communities, for their bodies. And because of that, it means that when you have to protect yourself, and self-defense should always be on the table, certainly in the face of violence, that even the police are susceptible to pushback when they go into a home and they don't announce themselves and they sort of break down the door. How was she to know that they weren't a regular intruder from the neighborhood? And that's sort of the legal case that her team makes out for her, is that she was defending herself. She had no idea that these were police officers and that these police officers were actually in the wrong. And during 1919, like, this just doesn't get any more incredible to me to think about how a black teenage girl might be able to use the law to some extent to her advantage. The law is rarely a benefit to black people.
It's interesting because there's like this other layer too that she could never use in court, but that even if the police had announced themselves, that doesn't mitigate the threat that they pose, because the way that the police were acting during this uprising was to take the side of the white mob and the white rioters. And they were as much a threat to her life as the mob that was outside the door.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, this is during a time when President Wilson is, you know, in office, and he delays sending troops. You know, people are like, when are you going to stop this? Are you going to put it into this? Eventually, he sends 2,000 troops to sort of stop the rioting. But really, it was a rainstorm. It was a torrential rainstorm that sort of quailed the chaos and brought things to a halt. But even in that moment, leadership at the very, very top was not invested in immediately stopping this violence.
You do such a good job in the book, Kelly, actually explaining some of these dynamics in Washington, D.C., because D.C. was a place apart. It was a place where there was Black wealth and a robust Black middle class. And it does seem that even though you tell all of these stories of Black resistance from places of impoverishment and very little political power, it's fascinating to watch what resistance looks like in a place where people have resources and a kind of political self-consciousness and self-confidence that allows for a kind of organized armed resistance to these white mobs.
Yeah. I think, what happened in Washington sent a message, not just in D.C., but across the country that, that Black people can and will push back, and that this is what it can look like when it happens.
Great.
And that, when white people take up violence, that they also put their own own lives on the line.
In terms of the sort of themes that you explore, resistance, refusal, force, not like, where do you put her story? What do you see it as, an act of resistance?
It's tough because I say in the introduction that, like, we have all of these different remedies, but that sometimes there are multiple things happening all at once. So with Carrie, I certainly see this as protection. I also see this as force, because it is. And in some ways, for the Black community, it was joy. And I want to explain the joy. The joy comes because out of all the riots that happened in 1919, and these were devastatingly violent massacres that happened in the Black community, Washington, D.C. is an anomaly because it's the only riot in which the white casualty numbers were higher than the Black casualty numbers. And that was seen as a victory throughout the country. There were people who wrote letters into the NAACP basically saying that they were rejoicing, that they were delighted, that they couldn't believe that Black people were fighting back in this way. Black people were going to gun dealers and buying guns and, forming barricades around their neighborhoods and protecting even Howard University, protecting what was theirs and making sure that it was not destroyed. And so that brought a lot of pride. And so I see a lot of things happening in this moment. It involves a lot of different sentiments and feelings and attributes. And that's what I kind of think a lot of Black resistance is. It's never just one thing. It's never just violence or nonviolence.
So let's leave it there. And I think you were nicely coy there about what happens in the rest of the story. We will say that it does
I know,
go...
if you want to know, you're going to have
exactly.
to read.
Or Google, or go listen to the episode we did. But really, you should buy the book and read, or listen.
Yes.
But it does go to the courts and has a very sort of interesting chapter there. But to wrap up, you did mention, just now, this idea of joy and how all of these terms that you're using are so much more complicated and subtle and nuanced and flowing in and out of each other. And I'm very fascinated by the way that joy plays into this. And that's going to be the sort of focus of the next episode. We're going to talk a little bit about the link between resistance and joy, especially in a more modern era. So that will be in our third and final episode of We Refuse Week, which is coming up next. But let's leave it there for now. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Hey, it's Jody. Did you know that Radiotopia has a reality dating podcast? It is called Hang Up, and it's kind of like a queer cross between The Bachelor and Love is Blind. Each week, the star goes on phone dates with the callers, and then one caller is eliminated week by week. They do not see each other. Here's a taste of Hang Up.
Our star Timo is 41 years old and recently divorced.
I haven't been on a single date in 18 months.
But now, they're looking for someone special.
And really hot sex. Really hot public sex.
So we set them up with 6 callers to date exclusively over the phone.
I feel like I could talk to you for hours.
Now, at the end of all this, the last caller standing can choose the star back as their soulmate and go on an all-expenses-paid vacation together, or choose a cash prize instead. Hang Up is hosted by Zakiya Gibbons, one of my favorite people at Radiotopia, and not for nothing, the artwork for this new season is incredible. So check it all out. It is like nothing else being done in podcasting right now. Season 2 of Hang Up, out now on your favorite podcast platform.
Radiotopia.
From